the Gaggle will challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:07 p.m. in a, I have to say, the Central European city of Budapest, where, well, it's not, there is the daylight is now gone. However, however, I have to say that these are the last days that one can enjoy in any year, because the days are still long, and they're going to continue to get longer until June the 21st. And then, as I've pointed out before, it's just all downhill all the way, as we notice day by day how much less daylight we're getting, until we get to the darkest, grimmest, unbearable, lightless, sunless days of winter. But on a more uplifting note, thank you very much, everybody who has joined me for the Thursday night. Robert says, hello, George, from a 90-degree New Jersey. Wow, it's 90 degrees. Here it's still quite seasonable, 90 degrees. That's and I love it that you refer to it in Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit is what I understand. As I've said before, Celsius just leaves me completely befuddled. The only way I can understand it is by converting into Fahrenheit. And then Gurney Halleck says, George is the mayor of Gloomsville. Yes, I am. That's dismal city is my home. And Dr. Nostran says, I grew up in the desert. July and August were pretty unbearable, 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, but with little, if any, shade. No, I'm not saying that heat is desirable, or that I would particularly want to live in a hot climate. My only concern, as always, is with the lack of daylight. The loss of sun in the fall and winter. I find that very hard to cope. I don't find the cold particularly hard to cope with, and heat. I'm not a huge fan of great heat, but I don't complain about it that much. But I've never really lived in an especially hot place such as Arizona or Florida. So I don't know. New York could get quite hot, but I never found it to be unbearably so. Anyway, there's a number of things that I want to get to today. But the first thing I want to start off with is Russia. So in Russia today, it's a national holiday, and it's called Russia Day. And what's kind of interesting about Russia Day, at least this year in 2025, is that it was marked and commemorated. Peter Kovac says, what do you think about the protest in front of the Hungarian parliament on June the 10th? Well, I don't think much of it. Yes, so my feeling is that we're in the midst here in Hungary of a color revolution. I mean, there's an attempt to create a momentum to suggest that Orban is through, Orban's finished, Orban will lose the next year's elections, and Orban is history. They want to create this momentum to get everyone to believe the inevitability of Orban's defeat next year. So every day there are protests somewhere about something. They're led by the opposition leader, who's a former supporter of Orban's, Peter Magyar, and the model for all these color revolutions is to create the sense that the inevitability of success, inevitability of victory. They did that most successfully for the first time was against Milosevic in 2000, which was that with that slogan "Gotovye," that he's finished, he's done. And they're doing that now with Orban. Now, this particular demonstration um, was in front of Parliament. That was about this new piece of legislation that Fidesz has proposed, but is now being put on the back burner. It's been postponed till September. It's about you know the perpetual problem in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. This perpetual problem of NGOs and or political organizations that are getting funded from abroad, and are therefore fulfilling an agenda of foreigners. And so this new legislation, much as the legislation in Georgia, was to insist on transparency from all organizations that are receiving money from abroad. Now, of course, if you crack down on organizations receiving money from abroad, you wouldn't really be able to get a color revolution going. Hence, you're getting masses of people coming out in these protests, as the one outside Parliament. Thousands of people. I don't. They said tens of thousands. It wasn't tens of thousands, but a few thousand people. They show up. And what do they demand? They demand, we don't want no transparency. The last thing we want is transparency. The last thing anybody wants is to find out how much money is coming from abroad for political activities at home. So the demonstrations here are very much similar to the demonstrations that took place in Georgia, which is we don't want legislation demanded that insists on transparency about foreign sources of income. But this demonstration is just part and parcel of many other demonstrations, like constant demonstration. Every day you go out in Hungary, and there's going to be another a demonstration about something. So there's the next one coming up is the LGBTQ stuff, because Hungary's Hungary has said that there's to be no any more of these gay pride demonstrations, and but other politicians are going to go forward with the with the demonstration. I think at the end of this month, or gay pride parade. And but I'm not sure how that's going to work out, because Hungarian law says no, we're not having any more gay pride parades because it's harmful to children. And but I guess the mayor of Budapest is still trying to push forward with that. But that's just one aspect. Then there's the demonstrations against corruption, accusing Fidesz of corruption. There are demonstrations about immigration. So there's always some demonstration going on in Hungary against Orban. That's what I mean. It's the goal here is to create this inevitability that Orban is very unpopular. Orban will lose next year's election. And of course, when you create that atmosphere, that first of all, that it demoralizes Orban's supporters. They think, well, he's going to lose, but it also provides the framework for challenging the result. If the result turns out that Orban has won, then what happens? As always, you cry fraud. Fraud. It was a fraud. It was a fraud. Orban stole the election. So I think that's why now. I think it's absolutely reasonable. Every country should have a foreign agents legislation. Every country should know exactly, who is receiving and how much from abroad, who are politically active. Whose agenda are they fulfilling? United States has had this since the 1930s, and every other country has emulated it, because it's a perfectly reasonable thing. And nobody says the United States should cancel its foreign agents' legislation, but it's other countries that are not allowed to do that. So that's yeah. But I just find it always hilarious when when you get this renter mob out there, with these young people demanding no transparency. I mean, you used to have demonstrations of young people would be demanding, we want transparency, we want to know what's going on, we want to know what the government is doing, we want to know what corporations are doing, we want to know what everybody's up to. No, 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 last thing we want to know is what is going on. Last thing we want to know is what foreign interests are behind political activists in Hungary. Anyway, that's sidetrack. I want to go back to Russia. So today is a national holiday in Russia. It's called Russia Day. And but before we get to what exactly Russia Day commemorates, what was first of all interesting was that Secretary of State Marco Rubio um, issued a congratulations to Russia, a very warm congratulations to Russia on this national holiday. So let's first of all take a look at what Rubio wrote. And here it is. Russia National Day, and June the 12th. On behalf of the American people, I want to congratulate the Russian people on Russia Day. The United States remains committed to supporting the Russian people as they continue to build on their aspirations for a brighter future. We also take this opportunity to reaffirm the United States' desire for constructive engagement with the Russian Federation to bring about a durable peace between Russia and Ukraine. It is our hope that peace will foster more mutually beneficial relations between our countries. So, a very warm message from him, the Secretary of State, congratulating the Russian people on Russia Day. United States committed to supporting the Russian people. Reaffirmed the United States' desire for constructive engagement with the Russian Federation, durable peace between Russia and Ukraine, and mutually beneficial relations between our countries. You couldn't hope for a warmer message, and particularly it's a message delivered on a national holiday for Russia. And this was, of course, taken up by by Dmitry Peskov. And here's the TASS report. Says a message of greetings from U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Russia Day is a very positive news, which shows that Washington is seeking dialogue. Peskov said, very positive news. It shows once again that the current administration in Washington is completely different from the previous administration of Joe Biden. The U.S. administration favors dialogue and solving the most complicated issues through dialogue, which coincides with our approach. And this is Peskov commented to reporter Zarubin. So this confirms what I've been saying all along. I mean, the notion that, Trump is just Biden, he's continuing with the Biden policy and so on. I mean, it's nonsense. Trump has attempted to carve out a different approach to Russia. Now, whether it succeeds, that's a different issue. And that, and obviously we don't yet know how that will fare. But clearly, it's taken a very different line. Instead of, remember what Biden was saying. He was calling for the overthrow of the government in Russia, and essentially, fighting to the bitter end against Russia. So this is very different in tone. But however, it's very interesting. Like, what exactly is Russia Day? Now, Russia Day commemorates the declaration of state sovereignty of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Russia on June the 12th, 1990. And, the Declaration of State Sovereignty was essentially that laws passed by the Soviet Republic of Russia would supersede the laws passed by the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. Now, at the time, of course, everyone in the West rejoiced about this because obviously they wanted to see the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And when you adopt this kind of legislation, then that hastens the path to dissolution, which is exactly what happened. So the first declarations of state sovereignty in the Soviet Union took place in 1988 by the Baltic republics. The Baltic republics were always likely to be the first to leave, and because they were never really declared to be, they were never really accepted by the West as having been legally incorporated within the USSR. I mean, de facto, they were accepted as republics of the USSR, but de jure, the West never accepted them within the USSR. Now, what was striking about this was that it was Russia, which is, after all, really the heart of the Soviet Union. And not only was it the biggest, the most populous republic of the USSR, but basically, I mean, they drove the revolution. I mean, the Bolsheviks were primarily Russians. They drove it. And so when the Russian Soviet Republic essentially declared that its laws superseded the laws of the Soviet Union, well, that was the death knell for the Soviet Union. And everybody else followed on from that. It was June 1990, and everyone else went ahead and declared, oh, yeah, our laws also supersede the laws of the Soviet Union. So this crisis that we have in Ukraine today, it all stems from these events that took place in June 1990. Who made this? Who declared this? The state sovereignty. Well, it was basically the first Congress of People's Deputies. It had no legal basis whatsoever. It was a new institution that Gorbachev created, this Congress of People's Deputies. And they had no basis of declaring that Russian laws superseded the laws of the Soviet Union. I mean, there was nothing, no basis whatsoever. It wasn't in accord with the USSR Constitution. No constitutional court said this to be the case. And yet these things were just simply accepted. And as I say, if Russia did it, then obviously everyone else started doing it. Belarus did this, Ukraine did this. And the path towards the Belavesh Accords in December 1991 was now clear. So there was no legality for it. There was no legitimacy for this declaration of state sovereignty. And it just shows you the extent to which the political leaders of the time just recklessly, irresponsibly, illegally went ahead and just dissolved the Soviet Union. An entity that had existed at that time, had already existed for more than 70 years. And so, that's why it's a very peculiar thing for Russia to celebrate this. Now, Russia, of course, when they say, "Oh, this is a Russia Day," they don't actually bring up the issue that, hey, this was really the beginning of the end for the USSR, and was there and essentially created the momentum, not only towards the dissolution, but also toward the enmity that was to be created on the part of the republics of the USSR, because Russia did this, and then of course Ukraine followed. Ukraine then declared its state sovereignty, and that was again the path was clear that Ukraine would very quickly come under the influence of the Western powers. I mean, the Western powers would see Ukraine as the Austrians did in 1914, as Germany did in 1941, as a very, very useful weapon to bash Russia. Um, so this is really the remarkable event that triggered the breakup of the USSR. And I think what's really pernicious about all of this, I mean, I think I've said this before, is that it was Russia that did this. If, let's say, some of the republics, let's say, all right, let's say it was the Baltics. Okay, the Baltics say we want out. Then Russia, Russia say, well, we want to keep the USSR going. Russia would then have a basis on which to say, well, you have to follow a constitutional procedure. You can't just simply leave whenever you feel like leaving. No one accepts that. No one accepts that you just have a right to go whenever you feel like going. I mean, certainly, the Americans fought a civil war on that issue. But given that it was Russia that made this move to declare its state sovereignty, then the very legitimacy of the USSR was called into question, because then, I mean, if the most important republic within the USSR declares that its laws supersede the laws of the USSR, then what exactly are we doing here? Why are we part of this? So if you look at what was said in that Declaration of State Sovereignty, here's the so the first Congress of the RSFSR's People's Deputies. So it's the first. So this was a completely new institution, and there had never been anything like this. This was all, these were all just kind of creations of Gorbachev's, who was just kind of, just pulling these things out of the hat like a magician, like, oh, we'll have a Congress of People's Deputies. And so here was June 12, 1990. And it solemnly proclaims the state sovereignty of the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic throughout all of its territory, and declares its resolve to create a democratic rule of law within a renewed USSR. So this is a renewed USSR, but of course it's not going to happen. And Boris Yeltsin, who presided over this first Congress of the RSFSR People's Deputies, Boris Yeltsin had no intention of keeping the USSR going. He's the one who signed this declaration into law. And he said, it's a sovereign state created historically by the peoples combined therein. The sovereignty of the RSFSR is a natural and necessary condition for the existence of the statehood of Russia. And then the bearers of sovereignty and the source of state power in the RSFSR are its multinational people. And then, so the state sovereignty of the RSFSR is proclaimed in the name of the highest aims, ensuring blah, blah, right, dignity, free development, and so on. And then he said, in order to ensure the political, economic, and legal guarantees of the sovereignty of the RSFSR, there shall be established the jurisdiction of the RSFSR when deciding questions of state and social life. Supremacy, here it is, the supremacy of the RSFSR Constitution and laws of the RSFSR throughout the territory of the RSFSR, the effects of the acts of the USSR which are contrary to the sovereign rights of the RSFSR shall be suspended by the Republic. There it is. The effects of the acts of the USSR which are contrary to the sovereign rights of the RSFSR shall be suspended by the Republic on its territory. Disagreements between the Republic and the Union shall be settled in the procedure established by the Treaty of the Union, and then so on. The exclusive right of the people in the possession, use, and disposition of the national wealth of Russia, and that's all. Now, as you can see from all of this, Russia had absolutely no right to make any of these declarations. None. This Congress of the People's Deputies, there was nothing about it in the Constitution. This is, as I say, it was just an invention of Gorbachev's. And you can't simply declare on a whim that your laws, your declarations supersede those of the Union. I mean, how do you settle this? Well, you settle it by a constitutional court. A constitutional court will have to settle about the constitutional questions. But it set in train the dissolution, and then of course in Yugoslavia you did the same thing. But in Yugoslavia, you at least had the core of Yugoslavia, which was essentially Serbia and Montenegro, that unlike Russia, said we want to keep Yugoslavia going, and that we are the core of Yugoslavia, and that anybody who wants to leave Yugoslavia will effectively be seceding. It will be seceding, and that is not prescribed by the Constitution, because according to the Constitution, there was actually no procedure according to which you could secede. I mean, in theory, in the Yugoslav Constitution, in theory, the 6 nations of the USSR could secede, but there was not the republics, the nations. And that's very important, that the nations and the republics were did not coincide. There were separate entities, the nations of Yugoslavia and the republics of Yugoslavia. But it was the nations that had the right to secede, not the republics. But there was no prescribed procedure for the dissolution. So if before anyone could secede, there would have to be agreement, universal agreement. All republics would have to take part in this, debate, as to how to effect secession. So that would have to be a constitutional process, and that there would have to be a dialogue among all peoples of Yugoslavia to decide what would be a proper procedure for secession. Otherwise, you can't just simply declare, well, we've done very nicely out of Yugoslavia. The government of Yugoslavia has invested a lot of money in our development, and now we want to go our own separate way and enjoy all this money that the government in Belgrade had invested in us, which is what, of course, Croatia did. Croatia was kind of made into this very nice holiday resort for Europeans primarily, who couldn't afford to go to the French or Italian Riviera. I mean, nobody could afford them. By the 1980s, nobody could afford to go to. They started investing. They started creating, the sort of holiday resort in Croatia, within Yugoslavia, in the 1960s, because already then people just couldn't afford, going to the south of France. But Yugoslavia was a nice substitute. It was quite inexpensive. and the seas were very nice, and they developed these beaches. Now, but the problem, of course, was, and this was pointed out by Milosevic, but that wasn't the important point. It was pointed out by the Constitutional Court of Yugoslavia that you can't just secede because everybody in Yugoslavia had contributed toward developing any individual republic. Everybody had to go short on something in order to make sure that uh, the Yugoslavia would have nice beaches and where Europeans could have a very pleasant holidays, affordable holidays, and so therefore when Croatia says, yeah, well, we'll just take the beaches and then we'll bugger off, bye, you said no, everybody has to have a say in the matter. And it was here that, of course, the European Union made its most pernicious and poisonous contribution by essentially, giving a nudge and a wink. And here was mainly Germany, but everyone followed the lead of Germany. Essentially, a nudge and a wink to Croatia. Keep pushing for secession. We will recognize that secession, even though the Yugoslav Constitutional Court had said no. And because they did exactly the same thing in Yugoslavia, in Croatia and Slovenia, they took their lead from what Russia did and declared the sort of sovereignty of their republics. They said, "Oh yeah, the laws and the constitution of Croatia and the laws and the constitution of Slovenia, it supersedes the laws and the constitution of Yugoslavia. Yeah, supersedes." And the Constitutional Court ruled, no, it doesn't, and you can't make that determination. You're just simply a republic. There are federal institutions, there's a federal government, and any of these issues have to be decided by the federal government. An individual republic cannot just simply declare from one day to the next, oh, our laws supersede the laws of the federation. But this is but as I said, at least in Yugoslavia, you had the core, as represented by Milosevic, which said that because we want to retain Yugoslavia, because we want the continuation of the state of Yugoslavia, anybody who wants out would thereby be seceding and would thereby be violating the laws of Yugoslavia and would thereby be violating the laws of the self-determination of nations of Yugoslavia. Because if you secede and you take the Republican territory with you, then you are violating the national self-determination of the nations that live on that territory. And this was really quite pertinent in the case of Croatia, where 15% of the population were Serbs, and these Serbs said, "No, we don't want to secede. We want to stay. We want to be a part of Yugoslavia." But it became truly horrific in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the Serbs comprised about a third of the population, and said, "No, we don't want to secede. Our national self-determination says we want to remain a part of Yugoslavia." But they did that in Yugoslavia, but they didn't do what Yeltsin did. I mean, what Yeltsin did, he just simply pulled the rug from under the USSR. Because from that moment on, once Russia itself, the most important republic, declared its intention essentially of leaving the USSR, then there was nothing really left. And so this was the moment, because after, as I said, after Yeltsin's or the Congress of People's Deputies declaration, all of the other republics, they followed suit. Yeah. Our laws supersede the laws of the Soviet Union, and so that became the war of the laws. And so by the time that Gorbachev in March 1991, if you recall, he introduced a referendum, that there would be a referendum um, on whether the people of the USSR wanted to retain their common state. Obviously, it wouldn't be called um, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, but it would be called something like a Union of Sovereign States. I think that was the kind of working title of what this new state would comprise. Um, and so Gorbachev held this referendum. A referendum, incidentally, well, that was supposed to be binding. In other words, whichever way it goes, everyone has to accept the results of the referendum. Anyway, he had the referendum overwhelmingly. I think it was something more than 80% of those who took part in the referendum said, we want to maintain the common state. So that was the decision. So in fact, the Russian people they had voted for the retention of the common state, irrespective of what Yeltsin and those people at the Congress of People's Deputies did, irrespective of that, because they were essentially moving towards leaving the Soviet Union. But none of the referendum said, no, we want to maintain um, some form of a common state. But Yeltsin had no intention, absolutely no intention of doing anything other than to secede. He was determined to secede. He used this union of this declaration of state sovereignty essentially to go to Belovej with the leaders of Ukraine. It was Kravchuk, and the leader of Belarus at the time. I always forget his name. It wasn't Lukashenko. It was the guy who preceded Lukashenko. They did that and they dissolved it. They dissolved the USSR. No legal justification, no legal basis for it, no constitutional basis, nothing. They just did it, boom, on a whim. They just did it. Just like this Declaration of State Sovereignty, just simply on a whim, they announced this. The reason I point this out is that it's a kind of an odd thing for Russia to commemorate. Now, of course, they call it a Russia Day, celebration of Russia. They don't dwell on what this holiday celebrates, which is this event in June the 12th, 1990. They never bring that up because it's a bit of an embarrassment, and particularly as Putin himself has said that that was a terrible event. If there's there's an event that I wish we could reverse, then that it's the dissolution of the USSR, done in and particularly when it was done in this entirely illegal and unconstitutional way. And so, there's really no justification at all for it. So, I don't have a problem with Russians having holidays. It's very nice to have a national holiday. But if you're going to have a holiday, fine, have a holiday to celebrate, May the 9th, or have a holiday to celebrate the victory at Stalingrad. But having a holiday to celebrate this, which essentially paved the way for that war with Ukraine. It was all basically it all goes from there. It was Russia that began this insane rush to declare state sovereignty, and it was inevitable Ukraine would declare the state sovereignty, and that Ukraine would, in no time at all, come under the sway, whether it's Austria, whether it's Germany, of the European Union, and Ukraine would be used by them as a cudgel with which to beat Russia. It was the series of events, was almost inevitable. Yeltsin absolutely didn't care about any of that. Absolutely didn't. He couldn't care less. All he was interested in was his own power. Anyway, the there was some has mentioned again. Summer Petro says Confederation of it's actually the Commonwealth of Independent States. That was created in following the Belovej Accords, December 1991. They created this Commonwealth of Independent States, which was basically completely meaningless. It was nothing. there was nothing in common and there was no wealth. I mean, it wasn't in any way a successor to the state of the USSR. What Gorbachev was talking about was what he was trying to achieve until the whole thing just blew up uh, in his hands through the August 1991 coup. He wanted to create this union of sovereign states as a successor state. The Commonwealth of Independent States is just nothing. I mean, nobody even ever talks about it. Anyway, that's that. And then the other thing that I want to talk about is the events in Los Angelo, Los Angeles, and the case that's now been brought by Governor Gavin Newsom against Trump's temerity in essentially nationalizing the California's National Guard, or federalizing the National Guard. Now, of course, any president can do that, and of course they have done it many times before. We talked about this the other day. You know, Eisenhower did it with Little Rock, Arkansas. Kennedy did it with Alabama. Johnson also did it with Alabama. Or in each of these cases, of course, you know, liberals clapped with glee and, of course, you know, absolutely delighted. Yeah, absolutely. You know, National Guard should be federalized. What the hell? We're not going to allow states to enforce their own laws. No. We're going to take over the rights of responsibilities of states. Now, Trump did something quite unusual here because he, the ultimately, if you if you move towards the getting the National Guard, federalize the National Guard, and have them involved in law enforcement, then you are in danger of violating the Posse Comitatus Act. But the way you get around that is by invoking the Insurrection Act. So the Insurrection Act kind of supersedes the Posse Comitatus Act. But Trump didn't invoke the Insurrection Act. He says he might still do that, but he hasn't done it. Instead, he kind of invoked the an Army Act, and which kind of gives he can federalize the National Guard, but they're more limited in what they can do. So in other words, they can protect local police, they can protect federal agents doing their job, they can protect federal buildings, but they can't themselves be involved in law enforcement, and they can't themselves carry out deportations, because that's really what started the whole thing. Was, these ICE agents were coming in to do the deportations, and they weren't being allowed to do their work, and so essentially Trump said, well, we've got to allow them, the ICE agent, to do their work, but the National Guard themselves couldn't engage in law enforcement and couldn't engage in the deportations. So this was the legislation that Trump invoked, and here's this 10 USC 12406, and this is the Armed Forces Act, and the wording, I mean, it's actually quite straightforward. It says, whenever the United States or any of the Commonwealth's or possession is invaded or is in danger of invasion by a foreign nation, 2, there's a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States, or 3, the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States, the president may call into federal service members and units of the National Guard of any state in such numbers as he considers necessary to repel the invasion, suppress the rebellion, or execute those laws. Orders for these purposes shall be issued through the governors of the states, or in the case of the District of Columbia, through the commanding general of the National Guard of the District of Columbia. So here are they put these three conditions: in invasion by foreign nation, rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States, or the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. So those are so you can easily see what the administration is getting at. They say, well, actually, all three of them all three of those conditions might apply because you have these illegals that could be said to be an invasion. They may well be representing a foreign nation. We see pictures of them waving the Mexican flag. Rebellion. Well, you could say it's a rebellion against the government of the United States if you're not allowing federal agents to do their job, then that's a rebellion. And then if the regular forces, not police or federal agencies, are not able to execute the laws of the United States, then those are the conditions that Trump invoked. But you notice that in the wording, it says, first of all, it's up to the president. It's within the president's discretion. The president may call into federal service members and units of the National Guard in such numbers as he considers necessary to repel invasion, suppress rebellion, or execute the law. So the president, considers necessary. So it's within his discretion. And then he says, orders for these purposes shall be issued through the governors of the states, and so on. So now, what Gavin Newsom has done, he claims, oh well, no, there was there was no need for any of that. There was no invasion, no rebellion. Regular forces were able to execute the laws of the United States, and in any case, I, as the governor, have the right to veto, even though there's nothing in that in the legislation. So here was this is the suit that Gavin Newsom has brought, and it may be that there'll be a ruling even as we speak. I don't know, but here it says, and it goes on. The president purported to federalize the California National Guard. Blah, blah. To put it bluntly, there is no invasion or rebellion in Los Angeles. There is civil unrest. That is no different from episodes that regularly occur in communities throughout the country, and that is capable of being contained by the state and local authorities working together. Well, that's very dubious, because people are watching on television. They see people seizing overhead passes and throwing concrete down on police below, throwing down motorbikes on police below. So it's a question of whether the argument that everything was under control was very dubious. And clearly, the ICE agents were not being allowed to do their jobs, and deliberately so, because the whole purpose, the only reason why we had this riot, and it wasn't civil unrest, it was a riot. The only reason why we had the riot is that the rioters were determined to prevent the ICE agents from doing their job. I mean, that was why they did it. I mean, it was, no ands, ifs, and buts. That's why they did it. And they were going to do whatever was necessary to prevent ICE from doing their job. And, Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles, and Gavin Newsom themselves were very much opposed to ICE doing their job. Why are they opposed to ICE doing their job? Because they declared California to be a sanctuary state. Los Angeles is a sanctuary city. And then he goes on. This is about the Angelinos. They've expressed the view through largely peaceful protest. This is the classic. The largely peaceful protest. Isolated instances of a more significant disturbance, Los Angeles area law enforcement has quickly and professionally responded with support from the California Highway Patrol and with additional resources available through state's well-established law enforcement mutual aid system. So it didn't really look, when people look, they say, well, you don't look like you've got things under control. And when you bring that up with Gavin Newsom, then Newsom responds, yeah, but it's all Trump's fault because Trump has been provocative. And it's, if he hadn't done this, if he hadn't federalize the National Guard, then there wouldn't be all these disturbances. So in other words, yeah, people can, they watch on television and they say, hey, yeah, it's out of control. So no, everything would have been in control, but it's Trump who has ensured that it's out of control. This is, of course, what they did in 2020. But in 2020, during the summer of George Floyd, things spiraled out of control, deliberately so, because the Democrats were determined to make the cities ungovernable, because they knew then in 2020 that Trump would be blamed for ungovernable cities. This was deliberately done. They knew exactly what they were doing. I mean, when Governor Tim Walz abandoned that police precinct, he knew exactly that once you do that, once you withdraw from a police precinct, then essentially the forces of law and order have given up. And essentially they say, that's it. We're not in control of anything. The mob can take over the city. And then who gets blamed for it? Well, not Tim Walz. Everyone has forgotten about that. It was Trump. Trump got blamed for it. Hey, you're the law and order president, and there's no law and there's no order. Anyway, so then Newsom goes on. The Marine Corps' deployment for law enforcement purposes is likewise unlawful. Well, he can claim it's unlawful. I mean, it don't make it so. For more than a century, the Posse Comitatus Act has expressly prohibited the use of active duty armed forces and federalized National Guard for civilian law enforcement, which Trump has not done. The Marines are not engaged in law enforcement. They haven't been used at all. And so far, only about 300 members of the California National Guard have been deployed, but deployed largely just to protect federal buildings. They have not been involved in law enforcement. They have not been involved in deportation. So this is all nonsense. And then instead, as established in the attached declarations, defendants, that's Trump and the federal government, intend to use unlawfully federalized National Guard troops and Marines to accompany federal immigration enforcement officers on raids throughout Los Angeles. Well, again, they're there just to protect the ICE agents from attack, and they will be attacked. There's no question. Of course they'll be attacked. Because the people have been given signals from Newsom, from Bass, that it's illegitimate to deport people. It is illegitimate. You have no right to deport them. And so therefore people are going to go out and do whatever is necessary and use what force is necessary. It's clear they're going to use whatever violence is necessary to prevent ICE agents from doing the job that they were assigned to do. Anyway, these unlawful deployments have already proven to be deeply inflammatory and unnecessary provocations. So in other words, they're more or less accepting that there's violence, chaos, disorder, but it's all Trump's fault. Inflammatory, unnecessary provocation, anathema to our laws, limiting the use of federal forces for law enforcement rather than a means of restoring calm. And then they must be stopped immediately. And then here was the response from Trump on behalf of the federal government. And he says, the plaintiff's claims are baseless. The president properly invoked his statutory authority Plaintiffs admit Los Angeles has experienced unrest, but ask the court to second guess the president's judgment that federal reinforcements were necessary. That's precisely the type of sensitive judgment that's committed to the president's discretion. As we said, that's correct. The statute is quite clear. It is within the president's discretion. It's not within the government's discretion, and it's clear that the president does not have to ask the governor's permission to do anything. They're committed to the president's discretion by law, and to which courts owe the highest deference. And the statute empowers the president to determine what forces he considers necessary to suppress a rebellion or to execute the federal laws, not the governor and not a federal court. And then plaintiffs also object the president did not consult with or obtain the consent of the governor. But the statute imposes no such requirement. It merely directs, as a procedural matter, that the president's orders be conveyed through the government. That's it, through the government. It does not say, and it says they were, not say that he needs the approval of the governor. Plaintiffs' objections based on the Posse Comitatus Act is equally misdirected. Neither the National Guard nor the Marines are engaged in law enforcement. Rather, they are protecting law enforcement consistent with long-standing practice and the inherent protective power to provide for the safety of federal property and personnel. Plaintiffs offer no contrary evidence, only a speculative assertion that the National Guard and Marines will be used for unlawful purposes in the future. And then, most fundamentally, plaintiffs' challenge to the conditions in California at the time of the memorandum is unreviewable because it is a statutorily authorized discretionary judgment of the president. When courts are confronted with a claim alleging that the president has violated the terms of a statute, long-standing authority holds such review is not available when the statute in question commits the decision to the discretion of the president. And that's why it says the section 124006 commits the decision of whether the conditions are ripe to call forth the National Guard to the president's discretion. And then I think it says, and then it says, defendants also acted lawfully in the presence they used to federalize guardsmen, and then so on. Again, the president, the statute is thus clear that the orders are issued by the president and they are conveyed through state officials. Nothing in the statute entitles a governor to veto or impede a valid presidential order. And then this is where it says, which I think is important, that had Congress wanted to give the governor veto power, it essentially could have done so expressly. And then they cite statute where it says, that members may not be ordered to active duty without the consent. So, they have different statutes where you have to have the consent of the governor. Or likewise, the secretary may order a member of the Army, Navy, Marine, or Air Force to active duty to provide assistance in response to a major disaster or emergency, but only after receiving a request from the governor. But in this section, yes, section 12406 omits any language even hinting that governor could withhold his consent. So to me, the arguments of the president are overwhelming. I thought that the Newsom's claims are extremely dubious. And clearly, it's not, the statute, he doesn't have any bearing at all on the statute. He can talk about the Posse Comitatus Act all he wants, but in fact, that's not what Trump has done. Trump has not invoked the Insurrection Act. Trump and is not asking the National Guard to engage in law enforcement. Okay, so now let me just No, I wanted to bring something else up, but now it's. Let me try. All right. So now the. Okay. The. Yeah. Now the. Because the one last thing before we get to some of the comments of Gagglers is whatever is going on with Israel. I mean, Israel and Iran, because there's all these stories that are appearing in the media that are declaring that Israel is about to unleash a bombing attack on Iran, and I'm very skeptical about this. I don't believe this. I think this is just fake news, because I don't believe Israel would do this. I don't think Israel would dare to defy Trump. And particularly, there are clearly the stories that are appearing in the media was saying that Trump has told Netanyahu not to do this while negotiations are taking place. And there is still negotiations are obviously taking place, because as things stand, there will be another round of talks about Iran's nuclear program on Sunday. So I just want to just quickly take a look at what the latest media stories are putting forward. And here's the story from Axios. And as I said before, I quite like Axios. They tend to be pretty, they're kind of the insider's insider. They usually are well-sourced stories. So exclusive U.S. fears Iran's response to Israeli strike would be a mass casualty event. Now, what you would get from a story like this is a clear warning to Netanyahu that if you attack Iran and Iran retaliates, don't count on the United States to provide you with missile defenses. That's what happened last year when Iran, when Israel attacked Iran, and then Iran and Iran attacked Israel, which is that the United States provided Israel with missile defenses, and therefore the damage caused by Iran was very limited. But if you say Iran's response would be a mass casualty event, it sounds as if the United States will not provide Israel with any safety in the event that Netanyahu decides to go his own way. So here we have White House envoy Steve Witkoff privately warned top Senate Republicans that Iran could unleash a mass casualty response if Israel bombs their nuclear facilities. With Israel preparing to strike Iran quickly if Witkoff's diplomacy fails this weekend, President Trump's envoy sounded the alarm about what would come next. Iran's retaliation could overwhelm Israel's defenses and cause heavy damage. And then Iran has also vowed to strike U.S. targets in the region in the event of an attack on its nuclear sites. The U.S. is in the process of withdrawing diplomats and military families who could be in harm's way. And then it goes on. Now, this seems to be very doubtful, because if Israel launches an attack and the United States does not take part in this attack, I doubt whether Iran will attack U.S. targets. They will know Netanyahu has launched this attack by himself, and I think, and that the United States is not covering Israel. It's not covering Israel with its nuclear shield, and therefore, I don't think Iran would want to attack U.S. targets, because then then Iran will be facing, U.S. retaliation. And why would Iran want to be attacked by Israel and the United States? That doesn't really make any sense. So I don't think Iran would attack U.S. targets if only Israel attacks Iran. And then Witkoff told the senators that military strikes by Israel are on the table if no agreement is reached. He then brought up Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, and so on. The U.S. is concerned Israel's air defenses would not be able to handle an Iranian response involving hundreds of missiles. So again, notice the tone of this. Israel is on its own. If you go ahead and attack Iran, Iran retaliates, you're on your own. The United States is not providing any kind of a nuclear shield for Israel. Such an attack, Witkoff told the group, would cause massive casualties and damage. Witkoff also raised concerns about Iran's ballistic missile arsenal during a speech in New York, calling it as big of an existential threat for Israel as Iran's nuclear capabilities. And then, according to U.S. intelligence estimate, Iran has 2,000 ballistic missiles with warheads that carry 2,000 pounds of explosive. On Wednesday, Iran's Minister of Defense claimed Iran developed a new ballistic missile with a 4,000-pound warhead. The U.S. official said that since the previous Iranian missile strike on Israel in October 2024, Iran has significantly increased production of ballistic missiles to around 50 per month. And then he goes on. The fact that two previous Iranian missile attacks ended with limited damage and few casualties gave Israeli officials confidence they could deal with similar attacks in the future. Yes, but the limited damage was because the United States came to Israel's defense and essentially used its missile defense systems to help Israel. If that isn't available, then Israel may well get thumped really badly by Iran. And here then is the New York Times, says Israel appears ready to attack Iran. And then it says Israel appears to be preparing to launch an attack soon on Iran, and a step that could further inflame the Middle East and derail or delay efforts by the Trump administration to broker a deal to cut off Iran's path to building a nuclear bomb. The concern about a potential Israeli strike and the prospect of retaliation by Iran led the United States on Wednesday to withdraw diplomats from Iraq and authorize the voluntary departure of U.S. military family members from the Middle East. And then it's unclear how extensive an attack Israel might be preparing, but the rising tensions come after months in which the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel has pressed President Trump to seize on what Israel sees as a moment of Iranian vulnerability to a strike. But all of this time, Trump has told Netanyahu that he's not interested in doing it. Now, admittedly, Trump has talked about he's not going to allow Iran to have any possibility of enriching uranium on Iranian soil. He's talked about that. But that's Trump negotiating with Iran on behalf of the United States. He hasn't said, oh, well, if I don't get a deal with Iran, then Israel will just go ahead and attack Iran. I mean, Trump has made clear that if there is, he has certainly threatened Iran with bombing, but it's clear that he means that it would be the United States that would bomb Iran. Mr. Trump waved off another plan by Israel several months ago to attack Iran, insisting that he wanted a chance to negotiate a deal with Tehran that would choke off Iran's ability to produce more nuclear fuel for a bomb. And 2 weeks ago, Mr. Trump said he had warned Mr. Netanyahu about launching a strike while U.S. negotiations with Iran were underway. So the negotiations are underway. I mean, there's going to be another round of talks scheduled this weekend. It's not clear how much effort Mr. Trump made to block Mr. Netanyahu again this time, but the president has appeared less optimistic in recent days about the prospects for a diplomatic settlement after Iran's supreme leader rejected an administration proposal that would have effectively phased out Iran's ability to enrich uranium on its soil. And then it says, then you got Iran's defense minister raised alarms with a warning that in the event of a conflict following failed nuclear talks, the United States would suffer heavy losses. But as I say, they're confusing different issues. They're confusing the issues of if Israel simply goes ahead and attacks Iran without getting an okay from the United States. In other words, just simply going ahead and doing that, Iran is not going to respond by attacking U.S. bases in the region. I mean, that would be stupid. And particularly as if Israel does go ahead, as I say, if it does go ahead, then I don't think United States will not provide any missile defenses for Israel. Israel will be on its own and will have to face a massive, possibly massive ballistic missile attack from Iran without the United States acting there as the shield of last resort. And here's an interesting article. This is from CNN. This was yesterday. It says Trump tells Netanyahu to end Gaza war and stop Iran threats. And it says U.S. President Donald Trump told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to end the war in Gaza and stop talk of an attack on Iran. The two leaders spoke on the phone on Monday. Trump said the call went very well, very smooth. The call for Israel to change course comes as Washington pushes for a nuclear deal with Iran and engages in indirect talks with Hamas over a ceasefire in Gaza. On Thursday, Hamas said it remains open to a ceasefire deal proposed by U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff, but said it requires stronger guarantees against Israel attacks. And then in a televised speech on Thursday, Khalil al-Hayya, high-ranking official in Hamas, said Hamas has not rejected Witkoff's proposal, but has submitted amendments with stronger security guarantees. Hamas wants any deal to include a permanent end to the war in Gaza and a withdrawal of Israeli forces. Trump and Netanyahu appear increasingly at odds over the war in Gaza as the conflict passes the 20-month mark. Netanyahu has made clear that his war goals include the complete disarmament and removal of Hamas, while Trump has pushed for an end to the war. And then it's one of several major issues in the region where a growing rift is emerging between U.S. and Israel. And then in recent weeks, the Trump administration bypassed Israel on a trip to the Middle East, reaching a ceasefire deal with the Houthis that failed to halt their ballistic missile attacks on Israel and lifted sanctions on Syria. And then during their call, Trump asked Netanyahu to stop talking about an attack on Iran. And a source familiar with the conversation said, and halt the leaks and reports about plans and preparations for an Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. And then Netanyahu has repeatedly pushed for a military option to stop Iran's nuclear program. In the conversation with Trump, Netanyahu told Trump that Iran is just trying to buy time and isn't serious about negotiations. So what these stories lead me to think is basically Israel is trying to up the ante. That's trying to force Trump's hand. And if one looks at the history of Israel is very shrewd. And Netanyahu, whatever else you can say about him, he's a very, very shrewd player. He's been, at the top of Israeli politics now for 30 years. And he isn't going to do anything that is likely to antagonize Trump and lead to a serious falling out between the United States and Israel. So all of these stories that we looked at, they all have the same thing. Trump told Netanyahu, stop threatening Iran, stop leaking all these stories about plans to hit Iranian nuclear facilities. The negotiations are still taking place. Any decision about attacking Iran will be made by the United States. If you go ahead and attack, and I think that was the thrust of that particular Witkoff, if you go ahead and attack without getting an okay from the United States, then you're going to be on your own to face Iranian retaliation. And it's clear that both Trump and Witkoff are saying, this retaliation could be quite severe. Iran has, quite a lot of ballistic missiles at its disposal. A number of those are going to get through Israel's somewhat limited missile defense systems. And so that's why I think that we're being fed a story. I think it's the Israelis are pushing these stories to try to force Trump's hand, and I think that I think Israel would be very foolish. And however much we dislike, and I certainly dislike Netanyahu, Netanyahu is not a fool, and I don't think he's going to do anything that will lead to a fallout with Trump. Anyway, let's now go to our locals community and take a look at the comments of the Gagglers. These are the people, these very generous contributors to the Gaggle, who keep the dogs going. Yeah, they keep, they make sure that the dogs are able to eat, they're able to live in comfort. They want to make sure that somehow the misery that would inevitably ensue can be pushed off for another day. And so I really appreciate all of the generous contributions of the Gagglers. They enable us to go on, doing the journalism and the commentary that we're able to do. So really appreciate you. Thank you very much. You don't get a thank you from the dogs, but I'm providing it. They don't. No one taught them good manners, but so I'm thanking on their behalf, even if they don't do it themselves. Anyway, so let's look at them. Dr. Nostrand. Dr. Nostrand. So you took that name from Seinfeld, from Kramer. That was his alter ego of being Dr. Nostrand. Didn't Hungary have a color revolution of sorts back in 1956? I wouldn't have said it was a color revolution. I mean, I think that it was it was a genuine uprising. I think. I don't think. I mean, there were. I mean, if you're thinking about, well, was there instigation from abroad? And I think there was a certain amount of instigation from abroad in 1956. I don't think that was that was determinative. I think that there's no question that the broadcast by Radio Free Europe preceding the October 1956 were irresponsible, but there were others, not just from Radio Free Europe. Various emigre circles that were funded by the U.S. government were were broadcasting into Hungary and suggesting to the Hungarians. Radio Free Europe, I don't think actually said explicitly that if you rise up against the communist government, the United States would come in on your behalf. Radio Free did radio. I mean, there wasn't an inquiry after 56. The U.S. government conducted an inquiry into the Radio Free Europe broadcast. Did Radio Free Europe tell the Hungarians that the United States would come in on their behalf if they rose up? And they said that there were no explicit. You could say there was an implicit suggestion that would happen, but no one actually said explicitly the United States would come in on behalf of the Hungarians. Having said that, I mean, obviously, that taught the Americans for a time, anyway, that you really don't want to go around encouraging and instigating uprisings, and then essentially abandon them. When the uprising and uprisings take place. So the American government said, we're not going to do that anymore. But afterwards they did come back to do that. After the Cold War, they did just exactly that. But they burnt their fingers with Hungary, and they said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Now, having said that, the Hungarians themselves had to have known that the likelihood of the United States coming in on their behalf was, infinitesimally small. And how did they know that it's infinitesimally small? Well, because they didn't do anything during the June 1953 uprising in East Berlin. I mean, that's exactly the same thing happened. The workers of East Berlin rose up against the Soviet leaders, and this was in Berlin. Remember, this is Berlin, where there was actually a Western presence in Berlin. There was no wall then, so there was no wall separating the occupation zones of Berlin. But the Americans and the British and the French stood by and watched the suppression of the 1953 uprising. So if that's what happened in 1953 in Berlin, I mean, there's no reason for the Hungarians to think that anybody was going to come in on their behalf. And what was particularly striking when you think about October 1956 is what were the Americans really preoccupied with in October 1956? Well, it was the Suez Crisis, because that mattered to the Americans. I mean, the Americans essentially were now saying the Middle East is our playground, and we're not going to have these British and French, the old imperial powers, reassert their dominance in the Middle East. And that mattered more to them than Hungary, and rightly so. I mean, they thought, hey, this is a Soviet sphere of influence. This is the outcome of World War II. We're not going to alter. We made that decision in 1945 that this is the result of World War II. We're not going to try and alter it. But by the same token, in 1945, the decision was taken that the Middle East, and in fact all of the old colonial regions, would no longer be under the domination of the old colonial powers. Whether it was Indochina or anywhere else, they said no. So we're not going to allow the British and the French to come back into the Middle East. And so that the Americans were much more preoccupied with that than with Hungary. And so the uprising was put down swiftly and quite brutally, and the Hungarians, learned their lesson, and they never tried anything like that again. But I mean, the question is, was it a color revolution? Was it instigated from abroad? To a certain extent. But unfortunately, some hotheads took over, as often happens, um, and the cooler heads that should have prevailed, and then they that didn't happen. And unfortunately, Imre Nagy, the um, the Hungarian leader at the time, the prime minister at the time, he was a he was not the right man at the right moment, and he kind of was not one of the cooler heads. He lost control of the situation, and essentially played into the hands of the of Moscow. Probably wouldn't have made any difference. Moscow was not going to let Hungary go. But given the mistakes that were made by Imre Nagy, it made things much easier for Moscow. Anyway, then thank you, Dr. Nostrum. Vic Shakapopoulos. Oh, we're off on Cyprus again. All right. I'm sorry, George. So okay, all right. I don't want to talk about it for the fourth time, but I am going to. All right. But I just wanted to correct your factually wrong statements. Please just research the history of Cyprus and check the basic timeline and numbers. The first census on the island conducted by the British was in 1881, right after they acquired it in 1878. According to the census, Greeks constituted 74% of the island's population. Are you suggesting that they flipped the island's demographic upside down in 3 years? Well, the migration into Cyprus had been taking place for quite some time, but in any case, it really matters very little. I mean, it doesn't help your argument at all. Um, the question is not were the Greeks the majority population of Cyprus in the 1950s and the 60s and 70s. Of course, the Greeks were the majority population. The question was, is that determinative for the question of where and to whom Cyprus will belong? Now, the Ottomans regarded Cyprus as belonging to them. That no one at any time, no power at any time had said that Cyprus belongs to Greece. The fact that the Greeks were the majority population in Cyprus. I mean, the question is still it was the British had been using Cyprus for years and years and years and years. That was what was bringing this population. The Greeks were coming to Cyprus. I mean, it happened in a lot of places. It happens in Malta and everywhere else. Any island that the British were using for their navy became a magnet for population. People were leaving Greece proper and coming to Cyprus because that's where work was. But that still doesn't deal with the issue. I mean, what I was talking about earlier about how we determine secession and what belongs to what. Just because you are the majority population, it doesn't mean anything. Absolutely means nothing. There has to be a mutual agreement, and it has to be done in a legal way, and it has to be done in a constitutionally prescribed manner. So the question of, they have the majority, so the majority prevails. Well, no, never has. That's the first step of a process to determine where, whether secession is proper, where this territory should belong, and so on. And that was the case of Cyprus. Yes, the Greeks were the majority, but the no none of the international um, none of the great powers decided that Cyprus would be given to the Greeks. All of that was discussed. All of these issues had been discussed during the war, after the war, as to what happened, what is to take place with Cyprus, and they rejected. It was rejected by the British, by the Americans, that Cyprus would be given to Greece. I mean, it was just that was the decision. You can argue about this, but once that decision was made, then it wasn't going to be overturned because some nutcases seized power in Cyprus. They overthrew Makarios and and proclaimed enosis. Greece itself hadn't proclaimed enosis. Even Greece knew perfectly well. Oh no, Athens knew perfectly well. This is not going to fly. This isn't going to be acceptable. And why I said that this was a foolish step, because it provided the opportunity for Turkey to do what it did. That what Turkey did was outrageous. It was absolutely outrageous. There was no justification whatsoever for the invasion of Cyprus. But that moment when these crazies seized power in Cyprus and proclaimed enosis, that provided the trigger for the Turks to do what they always wanted to do. Um, and, um, and so that's why I have I you know if you ask me what do I think, that I'm not defending Turkey at all. I think exactly. I think Turkey behaved outrageously. There was no justification for it. And there's nothing, no defense whatsoever that you can make for what Turkey did in '74. That's why when you deal with these issues of secession and irredentism, you have to be very careful. It's not enough to have a referendum or a plebiscite or decide, oh, we have a majority here, so we're going to go ahead and secede, or we're just going to go ahead and join another state. You can't do that, because you've got to make sure that it's done in a legal, constitutionally prescribed manner that is acceptable to others. And that's not, and that's why I was talking about Yugoslavia, how outrageous it was what happened in Yugoslavia, where they played that game as well. Oh, hey, we've had a referendum. Oh, goody, we have a referendum and we made a decision. Croatia will secede. And you look at the disaster that brought. You can't do it. Any referendum is merely the start of a negotiation. It's not the end point of anything. It's the start of a negotiation. Anyway, Vic goes on. So I don't believe the idea of enosis was by any means nutty. Of course, it was nutty. It was nutty if the British and the Americans are not behind you, and if the Turks are going to use it as an excuse to invade your island, and nobody's going to support it. Yeah, it's nutty. It was nutty. It was a catastrophic decision taken by really nutty people in overthrowing Makarios. It was nutty. I mean, yeah. You think that anyone's going to get the Turks out? No one's going to get Turkey out. That's it. They've taken a part of Cyprus, and they're not going to give it back. And that was the result of that stupid thing to do, which was to overthrow Makarios. Yeah, nutty. Maybe it was 1960, it was unrealistic. Yeah, it was unrealistic and nutty. But in principle, it was perfectly in line with the spirit of the UN. No, it's not. No, it is not. The UN, yes, the UN talks about the self-determination. But self-determination is just simply the start of a process. It has to be done in a legal way, in a legal, constitutionally prescribed way. Simply having a plebiscite is simply the first step. It's not what the UN said. In principle, yes, there is such a thing as the self-determination of peoples. But that's just in the abstract. How we bring that about how self-determination can come about, how you can get everybody to agree, and it's done in a way which is prescribed by the law, by the Constitution. That's the hard part. And that's why I brought up the cases of what with those ridiculous decisions on the part of the Congress of the People's Deputies, or Declaration of State Sovereignty, and particularly in the case of Yugoslavia, when they had these referendums in Croatia and Slovenia, and then they said, "Oh, okay, we had our referendum, we're out of here." Well, look what happened. You had civil war. It broke. You had. That's exactly what happens when you do something like that. You do something unilaterally. Then you're going to bring about disastrous consequences. Now, in this case, I mean, in the case of Cyprus, it was particularly disastrous. It was a coup. It was an armed coup that overthrew Makarios. I mean, these people just overthrew him. It was a coup. There wasn't even a referendum. So you have no legality whatsoever. So to start proclaiming enosis, and by doing that, you gave those creatures in Ankara the excuse they wanted. Oh, okay, they always were looking for an excuse to humiliate the Greeks, and that's what they did. They humiliated the Greeks. It was a foolish thing to do. Anyway, nothing special about it. It literally happened just 10 years ago, in 1949. Just check if that's all I want. Well, your facts again. What? There's no facts here. You're not giving me any facts. You're wrong. What happened in Cyprus was a foolish decision taken by these nutcases who were pressing for enosis when they knew that they would have no support from the great powers to bring this about, and particularly given that they would face the full might of Turkey, which is much stronger than Greece and certainly much stronger than the Greek Cypriots. That's it. I don't know what facts you're talking about. That's the reality of it. There was an absolutely disastrous decision that was made by these crazies who overthrew Makarios. So I mean, I think I've said what I had to say several times. So anyway, Dr. Nostran says Marco's ghostwriter actually sounds like a diplomat. Steve K9. Oh, it's good to see you again, Steve. Got to miss you for a while. Steve says, I think I remember Yeltsin, when asked why he wanted to be president of Russia, saying something like, "That's what really matters. Forget the Soviet Union." Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think he said those kind of things. I remember when he came to the United States, I think it was in early 1992, triumphant, just after he broke up the Soviet Union for the Belovesh Accords, and he addressed the joint session of Congress, and he was absolutely telling them, "Hey, the Soviet Union is no more. Communists have gone. All those terrible things that you Americans have hated have now been eliminated." And of course, they were all jumping up and down, like clapping seals. It was congressmen and senators, thunderous ovations, and you have to think, well, these are your adversaries. If they're cheering you on like this, you can't have done very much for your country. And of course, he didn't. And that's why what happened with Yeltsin, it was just such an unmitigated tragedy. That doesn't mean that the USSR was a great place, or that especially the communist system needed to be preserved. But what you did have to do is to preserve some form of a common state that was clearly in the interests of the overwhelming majority of the people of the USSR. And that was the case. And that referendum that was held in March 1991, and as I say, it was a binding referendum, was overwhelmingly in favor of keeping that state going. Yeltsin went against that for his own opportunistic reasons. Yeltsin wanted to be president of Russia, and he saw that the only way he could be president of Russia is if he essentially broke off ties between Russia and the Soviet Union. So Russia, in effect, seceded from the Soviet Union. And it was for opportunistic reasons. The rest of the republics had been cooperating. Remember, so we had the March 1991 referendum, and then Gorbachev continued negotiating with most of the republics who wanted to continue with this whatever successor state would emerge in place of the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev continued those negotiations. Even after the August coup, when Gorbachev came back, now of course much weaker, the negotiations continued. The reason why those negotiations then collapsed was because of Belarus. That essentially Yeltsin seceded. And at that point, those republics who had been negotiating with Gorbachev, I said, well, that's it. I mean, there's no Gorbachev, there's no Soviet Union. We're also out. We're leaving as well. But Yeltsin didn't care at all about that. Anyway. And Steve K9 says, if you want to go further back, the southern United States had every right to secede. Well, that's the argument they absolutely made. Yeah, we had the right to secede. And then again, that was the decision was made and said, well, no, you don't have a right to secede. You can argue by the laws and say, well, yeah, but we're democratic, and we made our decisions, and we represent the majority, whatever. But there is no fundamental right to secede, and that was made clear to the Confederacy. Anyway, thank you, Steve K9. Judy Hotchkiss. Judy, thank you very much, Judith. Always very good to see you. Thank you for your generosity. So Judy says, color revolution in the U.S., around 40% of LA's residents speak Spanish at home. Yeah. Was this somebody I heard the other day that just the illegal migrant community in LA, just the illegal migrant community, would comprise, I think, the 7th largest city in the United States. I can't remember the number. I think it was Mark Grobard who said this. So the illegal migrant population of LA is about 1.2 million, would be about the 7th largest city in the United States. So around 40% of the LA's residents speak Spanish at home. Some of the rioters there are calling for joining Mexico. And on June the 9th came the speech from Mexico. Mexican Senate President revives territorial claims. We'll build the wall and pay for it, but according to the 1830 map of Mexico, Mexicans were settled in these territories before the U.S. The Mexicans living there are in what has always been their homeland. Well, that's a very interesting, but I also think that this is all a lot of big talk. The fact is, the people who were waving the Mexican flag have no intention of going back to Mexico. They have no intention of living in Mexico. They have no intention of accepting the jurisdiction of the Mexican government, because why are they in the United States? Well, they're in the United States because it's a rich country. It has a very generous welfare system, certainly a welfare system for migrants. After all, migrants get free health care. They don't have to pay for it. And they get free education. They don't have to pay for it. And then they get all sorts of free welfare services for their children and whatever, free housing. Why would they want to give any of that up? If you become part of Mexico, you're not going to enjoy any of that. So there's a lot of big talk about secession or irredentism, Mexican irredentism will join Mexico. No, I mean, the people waving the Mexican flag don't want to live in Mexico. They may hate the United States, but they like the welfare that you get in the United States. They hate everything else about the United States. But if you're getting payments, and you're getting you can get a decently paid job illegally. You got a fake ID, fake driver's license. Yeah, of course you're going to go on living in the United States while pretending that your true allegiance is to Mexico. So I think it's a lot of again. I mean, a lot of times when people make these proclamations, oh, we want to join this or we want to join that, a lot of it is just untrue. It's like Kosovo. Um, Kosovo does not want to join Albania, not because they don't like Albania, but it's better for them if you've got two states and therefore two recipients of EU and US largesse. So you got Kosovo getting all sorts of largesse from NATO, from the EU, um, and then you've got Albania also NATO, EU money, and so they get two dollops of funds. If they were to create a single state, you'd only get $1 of funds. So despite all the talk that let's unite into Greater Albania, whatever, it isn't going to happen because once you become a dependency of on other states, then it's to your advantage to have as many dependents as possible. So I want to keep it separate. So that's why I don't think any of these people they absolutely don't like the United States. They don't like anything about the United States other than kind of you can get a nice job illegally, send money back to Mexico or wherever, and then you get all sorts of welfare payments, all sorts of things that ordinary Americans don't get. I mean, ordinary Americans don't get free health care. So anyway, Judy, thank you so much as always for your generosity for those bad dogs. Yeah, I will say thank you on their behalf. They're not going to say thank you, but I will say thank you on their behalf. Thank you so much, Judy. Um, and then uh, Dan Rock says Shukevich. What do I say Shukevich? The Ukrainian nationalist. But okay. Anyway, Robert, always thank you so much, Robert, as always, for your generosity. And Robert says, in light of Alexei Roshlikov's recent speech in the Latvian parliament defending the rights of Russian-speaking communities, can you estimate how many Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians were denied naturalization after the dissolution of the USSR over their inability or unwillingness to adapt to the native Baltic languages? Well, I think that was a huge number because, in particularly, Latvia and Estonia, they had very big Russian populations, Russian who had lived there for many years. They were Russian speakers, but they had moved into Latvia and Estonia years and years and years ago. And they were absolutely denied naturalization, denied all sorts of government benefits, denied the right to vote. I don't know the exact numbers, but just think about the population. Something like, I think, 30% of Latvia's population is Russian or Russian speakers. So all the denials, that's going to be a very substantial part of that. Estonia, I think, is about 20 or 25%. So that's quite substantial. Lithuania, I think, has a much smaller Russian population. But you're talking about, these are large numbers. This isn't a tiny minority. You're talking about 30% was denied. It's quite absolutely extraordinary, and they continue to be denied. They denied having Russian newspapers, Russian magazines, Russian books. They're denied the ability to watch Russian TV programs. They're denied the ability to watch Russian movies. This is, and what's so outrageous about this It's not just those of the um, by the inability to naturalize, and therefore they don't get the benefits of government citizenship. But what is particularly shocking is that Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are members of the European Union. And in the European Union, they're all supposed to adhere to all of these grand documents. They're all the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, the European Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the European social, I think, whatever it's called, Convention on Social and Economic Rights. I mean, they, one after another, the Treaty of the European Union. I don't know. I mean, all they ever do in the European Union is sign all these grand declarations. And here, right in the very heart of the European Union, Russians are obviously denied their human rights. They're obviously denied their cultural rights, um, and the EU couldn't care less. And that's why it's hilarious when you read these articles in Responsible Statecraft, which says, well, Ukraine must be allowed into the EU, and of course, once it's in the EU, then the rights of its minorities, its Russian minorities, will be protected. The rights of its Hungarian minorities will be protected. Polish, Romanian minorities, they'll be protected because it's in the EU. Because the EU is very big on protecting minority rights. I mean, that is so stupid. The EU does nothing, absolutely nothing to protect minority rights, and has no intention of protecting minority rights if that minority happen to be Russians. The EU is going to tell Ukrainians, "Oh, you have to protect your Russian minority." It's ridiculous. And whenever the Hungarians have complained about the treatment of the Hungarian minority in Ukraine, they get the back of the hand. You think, I mean, Brussels doesn't care about that. Hey, what do we care about the Hungarians? I mean, they're not doing anything to help Ukraine. But the hell with them. So, um, so we're talking about a very substantial problem. I mean, the Baltic states are obviously very small, but given the very substantial proportion of the population that was comprised by the ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, 25 to 30%. That's a big minority whose rights are being denied. Anyway, Robert, thank you so much. Really appreciate your generosity. Um, Steve Kane says, I've read that the only meaning now for Russia Day is the start of the holiday season, like Memorial Day. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that's fair enough. They don't really that when they celebrate Russia Day, but they never really talk about the origins of Russia Day. I mean, this is the origin. And I think it's a lamentable origin. So they just talk, oh, Russia Day, we're celebrating Russia, Russianness and whatever, and that sounds good, but it says, but that this was an act that brought about this misery that Russia is in now. There was that is never really remarked upon. Yeah, the holiday season, but yes, the Memorial Day, but there is a difference. I mean, in the U.S., I mean, Americans work. I mean, whatever else you can say about the United States, people work in the United States. So even though, yes, Memorial Day starts the holiday season, you don't really have a holiday season in the United States. People take a couple of weeks off at most. In Russia, people take a lot of time off. I mean, that's just, August. People take August off. They go to their dachas. War or no war, they still go to their dachas. I mean, you've heard Peter complain about, August. They shut down. RT essentially shuts down in August. And no crosstalk in August. That's it. They basically say, hey, well, you got to, enjoy yourself. You got, here's your 5 weeks off. What are you complaining about? And then people say, yeah, but I want to keep doing my show. No, well, you're not going to keep doing your show. You've got 5 weeks off. That's it. And my own feeling is that isn't good. I mean, I think people want to see shows. I think they want to see new content. They don't want to watch reruns. But but there it is. That's when Russian is. By law, in Russia, as in the rest in the European Union, by law, you get your 5 weeks or 6 weeks of vacation, and you've got to take them. But that's not how it is in the United States. Um, and Anne Marie, always very good to see you. Anne Marie, as I've said many times before, is we're very fortunate to have her. She's a distinguished musician, and she's of international renown. And the Gaggle Music Club posted last week Bruckner's Eighth Symphony, and Anne Marie has commented on it. So, as somebody who has played all of Bruckner's symphonies, which I think is just an amazing thing. So she's knows Bruckner from the inside, and so she's very observant, very insightful about Bruckner's music, and so she's written a little bit about Bruckner this week, and I think it's very well worth reading, precisely because it comes from somebody who knows the music and who's played the music, and so obviously she's a great fan of Bruckner, as am I, but she also offers some criticisms of Bruckner's music, and I think I don't want to spoil it for anyone, so I think people should go listen to Bruckner's Eighth Symphony and read Anne Marie's comments. As I say, they're very very sharp and to the point. So you can say she points to the good and the not so good aspects of Bruckner. So please read them. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Thank you as always for your generosity. And then Vic asks, what is your opinion of the 1978 Camp David Accords? It was a victory for Israel, but what about Egypt? Was Sadat a traitor or a realist? Was his call right, or is he responsible for the demise of his country? I used to have a strongly negative opinion about him, but I had some doubts. Maybe his folding to the West actually saved Egypt from the fate of Iraq, Syria, or Libya. What could be the alternative if, for example, Nasser had lived and continued his policies for another 20 years? Well, very good questions. Keep in mind, Nasser had very much been brought down to size following the 1967 war, which, of course, Israel started. And Israel started with a view to hurting Nasser. Nasser was much too smart to start any war with Israel. He knew he would lose a war with Israel. And he did. And of course, that meant that he really became very dependent on Saudi Arabia. And so that was the key moment for after 1967, when power began to shift in the Arab world from Egypt to Saudi Arabia. So up until then, Nasser was a thorn in the side of Saudi Arabia, because Nasser was waging this war in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia really hated that. But essentially, Nasser just after the 6-day war, Nasser wrapped up the war in Yemen because he now needed help from Saudi Arabia. He needed to recover from after the debacle of '67, and Nasser became much more a moderate figure. He, as I say, he wrapped up the war in Yemen, became very friendly with Saudi Arabia. He needed the Saudi money. And Nasser became also very open to a historic settlement with Israel. And again, that's often overlooked, that Nasser was offering Israel, after '67, a comprehensive peace. A comprehensive peace, which is obviously Israel would have to withdraw from all the territories it had taken in 67. Um, but in return, there would be recognition from the Arab states, and you know, Nasser put forward some kind of a solution to the Palestinian problem, the Palestinian refugee problem. Nasser was not putting forward um, a Palestinian state. He wasn't saying that there should be a state for the Palestinians. He was just simply saying there had to be a solution to the Palestinian refugee problem, which was in accord with all the UN resolutions that Israel had to solve the refugee problem. So Nasser said that there has to be a solution to the refugee problem, but Israel would have to surrender territory that he captured in 67, and there would be a recognition for Israel. So Nasser, at this point, had become very much a moderate figure and was actually in accord with the Nixon administration, which came up with the Rogers Plan. And the Rogers Plan wasn't all that different from Nasser's peace plan. I think it was around 1969. So that's the context, which, the Nasser dies, I think, in 1970, and then Sadat takes over. Sadat made the decision almost from the beginning that he was going to become a kind of a Western client state. He basically, almost from right at the beginning, he turned against the Soviets. There had been very good relations between the Soviet Union and Egypt. He turned against the Soviets, ordered all these Soviet advisors out of the country, and he became clear very early on that he would be moving into the Western orbit, even as he tried to extract some concessions from Israel through launching the 1973 war, which he could have pursued much more vigorously had he wanted to, but he decided not to. He crossed the Suez Canal and then did nothing. He made no move through the Sinai. He made that. I mean, I think what you're saying here is quite very insightful. That he wanted to avoid the fate of Iraq, Syria, or Libya. I think the states that defied the West, that defied the United States, he probably felt they're not going to end well. If you keep in with the Americans, you're going to get money and arms, and they will look after you. That was the decision that he took. And you could say, well, maybe from a kind of existential point of view, it made sense. He essentially took Egypt out of the Arab coalition. He suddenly declared that Egypt is not part of this whole rejectionist front, the anti-Israel front. And that of course fatally weakened the Arab front, because without Egypt, it's not it was hardly a formidable force. But now going back to your question about Camp David, well, that was what he did. I mean, he secured what he wanted, which was the Israeli evacuation of the Sinai. He got good relations with the United States, which again he wanted. Like Nasser and everyone else, he talked about there needs to be a settlement for the Palestinians. It wasn't just simply a Palestinian refugee problem. We talked about autonomy. There had to be some kind of autonomy for the Palestinians. There was nothing in the Camp David Accord that talked about a Palestinian state. It was just there had to be some kind of autonomy, a self-government for the Palestinians. But it wasn't within his power to deliver that. All he could get from Israel was concessions to him, which was the evacuation of the Sinai. But the rest, he could say, well, we should you know, we should try to do something about the Palestinians. The people have been trying to do something for years and years, but there's nothing you can do given, the attitude of Israel. So, I mean, to answer your question, well, what's my opinion? I mean, I can see why he did it. And it made sense for a leader of Egypt to think, well, I have to think about the Egyptian people. I have to do what's good for them. These wars that were waged by Nasser didn't serve Egypt well. Nasser may have been a hero in the Arab world. He obviously was. But they didn't serve Egypt well. It wasn't just the '67 war. I mean, all of those wars, the border wars that Norman Finkelstein talks about, and that Benny Morris wrote a book about, Israel's border wars, the ones that Egypt was waging. They impoverished Egypt, they weakened Egypt, and Egypt didn't get very much worse. So you can see why you'd say, well, I can't really sacrifice the Egyptian people for the benefit of the Palestinians. I mean, it's cruel, but you can see why an Egyptian leader might make that call. Anyway, thank you for the question. And then Dan Rock, thank you very much for the question, for your generous tip. Here's Dan Rock's asking question. Listening whilst on a bike ride in the middle of a desert in the UAE. Really, you're in the UAE? Ah, okay, bike ride. Whoa, must be quite hot. A bike ride in the desert at midnight. Will I be at midnight? Okay, will I be leaving soon? Is war about to blow up here, or is it a bluff? Well, as I was saying earlier, I tend to think that Israel is just simply trying to force Trump's hand. I don't think Israel is going to go ahead, launch an attack on Iran without getting the U.S. support behind it. At the moment, it seems to me that Trump is not behind what Netanyahu wants to do. All the stories suggest that he doesn't like what Netanyahu is doing, that Netanyahu is getting in the way of the negotiations. And if Israel goes ahead, does it without American support, then he's going to have to face the missile retaliation from Iran without the missile defense that only the United States can provide. So I don't think Netanyahu is going to risk it. But I mean, that's how it seems now. But Trump himself has kind of got himself into a box, because his stance now, which is no enrichment on Iranian territory, is a non-starter. Iran is not going to agree to it, and he's threatened war against Iran, or bombing of Iran, if Iran refuses to come to an agreement with the United States. There's no possibility of an agreement as long as the Americans continue to insist on no enrichment on Iranian territory. Then the United States, under Trump, will either back down, and I don't think that's likely, or will bomb Iran. That doesn't sound like a very good plan. Yes, Iran may retaliate. I don't know how effectively, and probably the American missile defenses, will probably work to ward off an Iranian missile attacks on its bases and so on. But the most important point isn't so much that, but that the most important retaliation of Iran would be, in the event of an American attack, is we're leaving the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that would mean the complete failure of Trump's policy, because now nuclear weapons for Iran would be guaranteed. And that would force Trump to go on bombing Iran to no particular avail. So I think that's why there's a deal to be had. I mean, obviously, there's a reasonable deal to be had. Iran's being very reasonable. It's not interested in nuclear weapons, but Iran's being reasonable, which is they want to enrich uranium on their territory. They're not going to give that up. Trump could easily accept it. It doesn't, and he decides to go down the path of attacking Iran. Well, then that's going to end badly. It's going to end badly, above all, for Trump's administration and for Trump's foreign policy. Anyway, thank you so much. I hope you don't get too hot in the riding a bicycle in the desert. I admire your fitness to do that, but so I mean, I love riding bicycles as well, but I wouldn't do it in the middle of a desert. But thank you so much, Dan Rock. And then Dr. Nostran says, unfortunately for Team Blue, conditions B and C are rather obviously fulfilled, and only one condition needs to be fulfilled. Yeah, I see. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. No, that was talking about the events in Los Angeles. So, Marty, always good to see you. Marty, as always, thank you for your generosity. Merry Thursday, George and Gagglers. Marty, always entertaining, all of your postings, and it's so enjoyable. When all the things that you dig up through amazingly fastidious research that you engage in. So all kinds of things that I assumed are no longer available on the internet, you managed to find them. So thank you as always, Marty. Really appreciate that. And then Vic Shakapopoulos says, since we're talking about riots, how about a film night on the topic? Okay, I guess there's some overlap with the 1968 theme, but still there are many interesting films to see, both documentaries and feature film. Lots of great positions on this list, for example. Okay, I'm going to take a look at that. Best protest movies. Yeah, those, yeah. Which was the one that was the riot? I guess, is that, would the Night of the Living Dead, would that count as a riot movie? I'm asking. I'm not sure. I'm just talking, thinking out loud. But I wonder whether the Night of the Living Dead counts as that. Richard Phillips, excellent as always. Thank you so much, Richard. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your generosity. And then Dr. Nostran says, except of course that the UK armed Japanese POWs in Vietnam in order to restore French control over Indochina. Well, it wasn't quite that. I mean, what they wanted wasn't they didn't want French control over Indochina. What they were most worried about was that the communists would take over in Indochina, and the French was all that they had to prevent the communists from taking over. So they absolutely did not want the restoration of the French colonial empire in Indochina, but that was the best that they could get at the time. I mean, this was absolutely declared by Roosevelt during World War II. No restoration of French rule in Indochina, no restoration of Dutch rule in Indonesia. That was the U.S. policy. But now with Ho Chi Minh clearly the dominant figure in Vietnam, there was nothing else. There was no other force to stop Ho Chi Minh other than the French. So the goal wasn't to restore French rule. The goal was to find some way of stopping Ho Chi Minh. As it turned out, the French weren't strong enough to do it, but they essentially had to go. The Americans weren't sad to see them go, but what they were sad was that the communists took over a large chunk of Vietnam. So no, they absolutely, the Americans didn't want the restoration of the Europeans, but they had to make a temporary peace because of the communists. Oh, I see. Dan Rock says, I see. When I typed Shukevich was when you you couldn't recall the Belarusian leader who betrayed the Soviet Union with Yeltsin and Kravchuk. I think that was his name. Was it Shukevich? Shukevich. I think Shukevich. Yeah, Shukh. Khevich. I think that was Shukevich. Was the Belarusian leader. Yeah, but Yeltsin, Kravchuk, and Shukevich, they met in Belavej and destroyed the Soviet Union completely illegally, unconstitutionally, and set in train the events that led to the war in Ukraine. It was inevitable that this was going to happen. Absolutely, anyone could have seen that this would happen. But Yeltsin did this out of ambition. However ineffectual Gorbachev was, at least he had the sense that unless you can keep something together, keep all these people together, there's going to be civil war. Sooner or later is going to come. And by and large, since initially there weren't any wars in the Soviet Union, it seemed, hey, it worked. That was in Yugoslavia it didn't work. There were wars in the Yugoslavia, but in the Soviet Union, hey, there were no wars. It worked. What we did worked. Well, it didn't work, and we're seeing now the consequence of that disastrous dissolution. FX Trader says Ho Chi Minh was misunderstood by the USA. Oh yeah, no question. I mean, they saw Ho Chi Minh as he was a famous communist. He was a leading figure in the Comintern. I mean, obviously he was was very well known by the Americans. So you can see why if you're fighting the communists, you would have concerns about a figure like Ho Chi Minh. But anyway, I think my time is up. Thank you very much, everybody who had joined me. Thank you very much for all of your questions and comments and challenges and thoughtful observations. Thank you above all for those who contributed something into the tip jar, who are thinking about the dogs and how to keep them living the lives that they're to which they become accustomed. And even though, however ungrateful the dogs are, I really appreciate that people are thinking about them and wanting to advance their standard of living. And then Dr. Nostrum says, except, of course, while Indonesia declared independence in 1945, they fought a war of independence with the Netherlands for the next 4 years. A refugee problem persisted at least until 1960. Yeah, that's right. But that was always a fairly hopeless endeavor. The Dutch were never going to hold on to that. In Indonesia, but anyway, and that's a really long story of what happened subsequently in Indonesia. But anyway, thank you all. We're going to do some more podcasts over the weekend. And then Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, then Peter and I will do our joint live stream. And then on Tuesday, we're going to have the solo, and look forward to seeing you all then. Until then, all the best. Good night. Bye-bye. See you.